Of racist, anti-black Supreme Court justices in American history. And who would have thunk it that an African American would rank right up there as being one of the most anti-black folks? And that is Clarence Thomas. My man George Curry, the late George Curry, who was a longtime editor-in-chief of Emerge magazine, actually put Clarence Thomas on the cover, portraying him as a lawn jockey.
On June 27, 1991, Justice Thurgood Marshall announced his retirement from the United States Supreme Court. Marshall was a giant of American law. He had argued Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court in 1954. He had spent his career dismantling legal segregation across the country. He was the first black man to ever sit on the nation's highest court, and now his chair was empty. 4 days later, President George H.W. Bush nominated Clarence Thomas to fill it. He called Thomas the best qualified at this time. Thomas had been a federal judge for less than 19 months. He had no major published opinions. The American Bar Association gave him a qualified rating, the lowest passing grade. But Bush needed a black conservative to replace a black liberal. Thomas was the play. The confirmation hearings in the United States Senate started in September. Thomas refused to take clear positions on abortion, privacy, or constitutional interpretation. He told the Senate Judiciary Committee he had never discussed Roe versus Wade, which almost nobody believed. The committee vote split 7-7, and they sent his nomination to the full Senate without a recommendation. Then, a name entered the story that changed everything. Anita Hill was a law professor at the University of Oklahoma. She had worked under Clarence Thomas at the Department of Education and then at the EEOC offices in Washington. She was a Yale Law graduate, she was black, and after her confidential statement to the FBI was leaked to the press on October 6th, the Senate reopened the hearings. On October 11th, 1991, Hill testified under oath before the Senate Judiciary Committee. 14 white male senators sat before her. There was not a single woman on the committee. Only 2 women served in the entire 100-member United States Senate at the time. She described Clarence Thomas repeatedly pressuring her for dates at the EEOC. She described him talking about pornography in their workplace, naming a pornographic film actor. In her sworn testimony, she told the committee that Thomas once picked up a can of Coke in his office, looked at it, and asked who had put pubic hair on his coat. She described him referencing the size of his own anatomy and discussing acts he had seen in pornographic films. That evening, Thomas appeared before the committee and denied everything. Then he delivered a line that landed like a bomb inside the Senate hearing room. He called it a circus, a national disgrace. And from his standpoint as a black American, he said it was a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deigned to think for themselves, to do for themselves, to have different ideas. He said it was a message that unless you kowtow to an old order, you will be lynched, destroyed, caricatured by a committee of the United States Senate rather than hung from a tree. That phrase reframed the entire debate inside the Senate chamber. Suddenly, it was no longer about what he did to Anita Hill. It was about what the Senate was doing to him. On October 15th, 1991, the Senate confirmed Thomas by a vote of 52 to 48. 41 Republicans and 11 Democrats voted yes. 46 Democrats and 2 Republicans, Jim Jeffords of Vermont and Bob Packwood of Oregon, voted no. It was the narrowest Supreme Court confirmation in over a century, and it remains the closest confirmation by a Senate controlled by the opposite party of the nominating president. Thomas was sworn in 8 days later at 43 years old. If you want to subscribe, the Supreme Court heard Shelby County versus Holder. The case challenged Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the formula that determined which states with a history of racial voter suppression had to get federal approval before changing their voting laws, the Voting Rights Act, the single most important piece of civil rights legislation in American history, the law that let black communities in places like Savannah, Georgia, Clarence Thomas's own backyard, vote without being blocked by literacy tests, poll taxes, and rigged registration systems. Thomas did not just vote with the majority to gut it. He wrote a separate concurrence arguing that Section 5 itself, the entire pre-clearance requirement, should be struck down completely. Within hours, Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott announced that the state's strict voter identification law, which had been blocked under the Voting Rights Act just the year before, would take effect immediately. Mississippi followed the same day. For the next decade, 15 states passed new laws restricting voter registration, early voting, and Sunday voting, according to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Thomas voted to make all of that possible, from Thurgood Marshall's chair. Then came June 29th, 2023. The Supreme Court struck down affirmative action in college admissions, 6-3. Clarence Thomas did not just vote with the majority. He wrote a 58-page concurring opinion, nearly 20 pages longer than Chief Justice Roberts' majority opinion. It was only the second time in a decade that any justice had read a concurrence aloud from the bench of the Supreme Court. He called race-conscious admissions plainly and boldly unconstitutional. He responded directly to Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissent, calling her reasoning cancerous to young minds. He voted to end affirmative action, the same policy that got him into Holy Cross, the same policy that got him into Yale Law School, without which he does not sit on that bench inside the Supreme Court. And while he wrote those words, his great-nephew's private school tuition was being paid by a white Republican billionaire. A year earlier, Thomas had joined the majority to overturn Roe v. Wade in the Dobbs decision, but he went further. In a solo concurrence, he wrote that the Supreme Court should also reconsider Griswold, the case protecting access to contraception, Lawrence, the case protecting same-sex relationships, and Obergefell, the case protecting same-sex marriage. He listed 3 precedents for reconsideration. He left one out: Loving versus Virginia, the 1967 case that legalized interracial marriage in the United States. The case that protects his own marriage to Virginia Jenny Thomas, a white woman. He wanted to revisit contraception, same-sex rights, and marriage equality, but not the one that applied to him personally. On April 6, 2023, ProPublica published an investigation that blew the lid off Clarence Thomas's financial life. And it was worse than anyone expected. For over 2 decades, Thomas had been accepting gifts from a man named Harlan Crow. Crow is the chairman of Crow Holdings in Dallas, Texas, a real estate billionaire who inherited his fortune from his father, Trammell Crow. He and his wife have contributed at least $14.7 million to political campaigns and committees over 3 decades. He is not just a friend, he is a man whose political network regularly files briefs before the Supreme Court. The gifts included private jet flights on Crow's Bombardier Global 5000, a plane that costs upwards of $10,000 per hour to charter. They included cruises on Crow's 162-foot super yacht, Michaela Rose. They included a 9-day trip to Indonesia in 2019 that ProPublica estimated could have exceeded $500,000 in charter equivalent. They included repeated visits to Crow's 105-acre private resort at Topridge in the Adirondack Mountains, and annual trips to the Bohemian Grove, an exclusive all-male retreat in Northern California. Thomas disclosed none of it. Federal ethics law, passed after the Watergate scandal, requires Supreme Court justices to publicly report most gifts, Thomas claimed a personal hospitality exemption. 7 ethics experts told ProPublica that interpretation was indefensible. Walter Schaub, former director of the United States Office of Government Ethics, said it is absolutely impossible that anyone could reasonably interpret that exception to apply to private jet flights, and the travel was just the beginning. In October 2014, a company controlled by Harlan Crow purchased 3 properties in Savannah, Georgia, belonging to Thomas and his family. One of those properties was the house on East 32nd Street, where Thomas's mother, Leola Williams, still lives. Crow paid $133,363. Then he renovated the house, added a new roof and carport, and started paying the annual property taxes. Leola has lived there rent-free ever since. The deed was personally signed by Thomas and notarized by a Supreme Court administrator named Perry Thompson. Thomas never disclosed the sale. Then, ProPublica dropped another report. In 1997, Thomas and his wife Jenny had taken legal custody of his great-nephew, Mark Martin, when the boy was 6 years old. Thomas told C-SPAN he was raising him as a son. In 2008, he sent Martin to Hidden Lake Academy, a private boarding school in Dahlonega, Georgia. Tuition ran over $6,000 a month. Thomas was not paying. Harlan Crow was. Crow covered tuition at Hidden Lake Academy and then at Randolph-Macon Academy in Virginia, Crow's own alma mater. Thomas's friend Mark Paoletta confirmed 1 year at each school, totaling roughly $100,000. Martin himself told ProPublica he did not even know Crow was paying. Thomas had previously disclosed a separate $5,000 education gift to Martin from a different donor, proving he knew these payments were supposed to be reported. The $100,000 from Crow went undisclosed, and Crow was not the only one.
I get you hard, but that
So-called, a Berkshire Hathaway alum, hosted Thomas at his ranch in Wyoming. Wayne Huizenga flew him on a private Boeing 737, flights valued at roughly $130,000 each way. Anthony Welters, a healthcare executive, paid off Thomas's recreational vehicle loan, estimated between $253,000 and $267,000. Fix the Court, a nonpartisan judicial watchdog, calculated in June 2024 that Thomas received at least $2.4 million in 103 documented gifts from 2004 through 2023, rising to approximately $4.19 million when likely but unconfirmed gifts are included. A December 2024 report from Senate Judiciary Committee Democrats, led by Chairman Dick Durbin, put the total even higher at more than $4.75 million since 1991. Nobody has been charged. Nobody has been punished. In November 2023, the Supreme Court adopted its first ever code of conduct, but it has no enforcement mechanism. The Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act was blocked by Senate Republicans in 2024. The most powerful court in the country operates on the honor system, and one man tested every boundary of it for 30 years. You cannot tell the story of Clarence Thomas without his wife. Virginia Jenny Lamp. Thomas is a conservative political operative with over 3 decades in Washington, D.C. She graduated from Creighton Law School, worked for a Republican congressman from Nebraska, then spent years at the Heritage Foundation and the United States Chamber of Commerce. In 2010, she founded Liberty Consulting, which she described as making her an ambassador to the Tea Party movement. She sits on the board of the Council for National Policy, one of the most influential conservative advocacy networks in the country. But before any of that, in the early 1980s, she was in a cult. Jenny Thomas was a member of LifeSpring, a group that former members and cult researchers have described as a mind control organization. She was deprogrammed in 1984. A 1986 video shows her speaking to a support group of former members about her experience. In a 1987 Washington Post interview, she said she had intellectually and emotionally gotten herself so wrapped up with the group that she was moving away from her family and friends. She met Clarence Thomas at a 1986 conference on affirmative action. They married in May 1987. After Donald Trump lost the 2020 presidential election, Jenny Thomas sent at least 29 text messages to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows between November 5th, 2020 and January 10th, 2021. 21 were from her, 8 were from Meadows. On November 10th, 4 days after Biden was projected the winner, she texted Meadows urging him to help the president stand firm and saying the majority knows Biden and the left is attempting the greatest heist of our history. She urged Meadows to make Sidney Powell, a conspiracy theorist pushing debunked voter fraud claims, the lead of Trump's legal team. She used QAnon-style language. She shared a video promoting the false claim that the Sandy Hook school massacre was a staged event. She also used the phrase, "Release the Kraken" in messages urging action. On January 6, 2021, she attended Trump's Stop the Steal rally near the White House in Washington. She posted on Facebook that morning expressing support for MAGA people and offering blessings to those standing up or praying. She later deleted those posts. When the January 6th committee tried to access Trump's White House records to investigate the Capitol attack, the case went to the Supreme Court. 8 justices voted to release the records. 1 justice dissented, Clarence Thomas. He was the only vote to keep those records sealed, records that contain his wife's text messages to the White House Chief of Staff about overturning the election. Jenny Thomas finally sat for a voluntary interview with the January 6th committee on September 29, 2022. She spoke for roughly 4.5 hours inside the Capitol. She told investigators she still believed the 2020 election was stolen. She insisted that she never discussed any of her post-election activities with her husband. Ironclad rule in their home. Nobody has been charged. No legal consequences for Jenny Thomas. None for Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas was born in a wooden shack in Pinpoint, Georgia, with dirt floors and no plumbing. His father left when he was 2. His house burned down when he was 7. His grandfather took him in and taught him one thing above everything else: do for yourself. Nobody is going to do it for you. And Clarence Thomas did do for himself. Pinpoint to Holy Cross, to Yale, to the Supreme Court. Every rung of the ladder that affirmative action, the Voting Rights Act, and the sacrifices of millions of Black Americans put in front of him. He sat down in Thurgood Marshall's chair inside the Supreme Court. And one by one, he started pulling those rungs out. He gutted the law that let his neighbors in Savannah vote. He killed the admissions policy that got him into 2 of the best schools in the country. He let a billionaire buy his mother's house in Savannah, pay his nephew's tuition at 2 boarding schools, and fly him around the world for 20 years while he voted on cases connected to that same billionaire's political network. And when his wife sent 29 texts to the White House trying to overturn an election, he was the only justice on the bench who voted to keep those records hidden. As of May 2026, Clarence Thomas holds the 2nd longest tenure in Supreme Court history. He has given no indication of retirement. In his chambers inside the Supreme Court, there is a bust of Myers Anderson. The inscription reads, "Old man Kent is dead. I helped bury him. His grandfather built a business from nothing, joined the NAACP, and bailed out civil rights demonstrators with his own property. His grandson became the most powerful Black man in the American legal system, and he used that power to make sure the door that opened for him would never open for anyone else."
White supremacists say we have our black lawn junkie. He is brought and paid for. He will help us take this country back to white power.